Thanks, everybody, for joining in. So our agenda today would be, how does Hasura make your life easy? Right? We will start with how there are common bottlenecks during your API development workflow, both during the build stage and when you're trying to deploy and go for production. Right? So we'll have a quick overview of what Hasura is all about. And primarily, this webinar is going to be dominated by the demo. But we'll have interesting checkpoints in the demo, and feel free to drop in with questions as well as you have on chat, and we'll be able to pick it up during the demo. But fundamentally, we're going to cover how Hasura auto-generates GraphQL and REST APIs on a database. We're going to use Postgres for this demo, and we'll create a couple of tables. We generate some APIs through Hasura and walk you over on how queries and mutations are generated. And we'll talk about some performance characteristics and how essentially Hasura is doing this all magically and also highly performant, right? And we'll go over some of the features of how observability with Hasura works, how can you monitor APIs, and then be on top of all the latency issues that are there. And as another checkpoint, we'll also look at how your security and authorization rules can be configured, because once you've done the API generation, the next big thing is about exposing the API to the public for any client access. And you might want to secure that API with some sort of an authorization policy, typically like a role-based access control system or some sort of a permission system. So we'll go over an example on that as well. And then finally, time permitting, we'll also look at how do you write custom business logic, because Hasura is generating APIs for you, but then you can also write your own logic to complement Hasura and extend your GraphQL schema that Hasura generates, right? So we'll go over all of these and feel free to drop in questions at any point of time. And we'll also look at common questions and objections with auto-generated APIs, because typically it maps to a database for the instant API, but then we also have a way to customize all the APIs that are generated, right? So we'll go over all of them, the concerns, and then we'll try to address them through the demo. Cool. So what slows down API development in today's workflow, right? Typically, when you're as a developer, you're building apps. During the development stage, you're writing a lot of manual CRUD boilerplate code for your APIs. Like you have a database or a data source, and you're just writing inserts, updates, basically the read and write APIs. There's a lot of code to be written. If you have, let's say, 50 tables in a database, and you're just fetching data and inserting data back into them, probably across joins, there are different relationships across these tables. So writing a lot of code there. And in case of GraphQL, you're writing a lot of resolvers, which is even more painful to optimize for, and it's a little new mental model to write if you're writing your own GraphQL server. Right? And you have to worry about input validation, and of course, as I mentioned before, after the API is generated, what else is there about security? So you have to think about who gets access to these APIs, and does this user who's querying this API has access to the right tables? All right, so you have a lot of configuration to worry about and actually develop in code for a lot of time. And eventually, you'll also have multiple sources and multiple APIs that you're interacting with, and you have to establish a relationship between all of them and then maintain that code. So that typically takes months of speccing out all of this work and to develop this API, right? The next bit is about productionizing the API, which is about how do you deploy this API? How do you worry about performance optimizations once it's live, once consumers start consuming it? Is it reliable? How can I do monitoring on this API? And of course, the API security, which is not just the role-based access control rules, but then also is the API protected from attack vectors, from DDoS, from API limits, IP-based limiting, and whatnot. So some of those are there. So we look at how this is now taking months and years to actually get into a stage where I can now deploy a production-ready API, right? Hasura basically automates 50 to 80% of this work for you, right? Now, if you look at the development stage where you're writing code for getting access to data from different sources, you're writing a lot of boilerplate code. What Hasura does here is basically connects to databases or data sources. Could be Postgres, could be Mongo, could be SQL Server, any database, right? And it basically essentially a compiler which just compiles your incoming GraphQL query into a SQL query or probably a NoSQL query in the Mongo store, right? So it essentially eliminates all of the boilerplate CRUD work that you've been doing for accessing data and like even manipulating data. So it takes care of the CRUD, the resolver code that you might have written with GraphQL. It typically is very hard to optimize for performance with the N+1 problem and whatnot. And Hasura also comes with a declarative authorization layer where you have a metadata where you can declare roles and you can control permissions using that, right? And there is like a federated layer where you can establish relationships between different sources as well. So Hasura takes care of, like it accelerates your initial time to market with auto-generating some of these work. And when I mean auto-generating, it takes care of this boilerplate work, but then also lets you take over from there. And like you can customize the API, you can customize a lot of things, you can write your own logic to extend the remaining bits of the API development work, right? So it's a very good head start. And then you take care of like probably your bulk of your API development work with Hasura. And what parts of productionizing the API that Hasura takes care of is about it's highly performant. It's actually slightly much higher in performance when you compare it with your typical DIY GraphQL server that you end up writing, let's say Node.js or Java or whatnot. We have benchmarks where it's highly performant than some of these because essentially it's a compiler which avoids N+1 problem when you're accessing a data source and whatnot. So you don't worry about performance optimization. You don't worry about monitoring because Hasura Cloud comes with monitoring and you can keep a track of what APIs requests are being made and whatnot. And API security, we do have enterprise level features to get access to some of the APIs based on different parameters, right? So you can do depth limiting, node limiting, API rate limiting, and whatnot in production. So you're not worried about your APIs being DDoS. I'll hand it over to Tristen. So Tristen has a personal story of how he actually used a different stack before Hasura, and he actually started using Hasura and he has a personal take on how he's approached this whole migration story and what parts of his development time was saved in this whole workflow.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Praveen, and thanks for that intro. So just a little bit of background for everybody. So my name's Tristen, and before I worked for Hasura, I was the CTO for a tiny delivery startup, and we built a fully autonomous retail organization. I can say that because after a couple months of not getting a paycheck, when my entire tech team and I walked out on the same day, the organization not only stayed in operation without a tech team, but my former CEO went and took another full-time job on the side since he wasn't taking a paycheck either. And the company ran itself for the next 7 months and then got acquired. And in that 7 months, there wasn't a single change to the code. That might not seem impressive, but understand our entire company was our app. Every single transaction was done through the app we built. I know because I integrated the Braintree payment code myself. Just to share a bit of what that was like and what we felt like when we discovered Hasura, I wanted to read a snippet from our epic, from our biggest app update ever when we migrated from Firestore to Hasura. So this is a screenshot of my old Notion board circa December 2022. You can see in the problem statement, this update implements inventory management, migrates our backend from Firestore to Hasura, adds staff checkout, implemented supplier tracking for ordering, adds product descriptions, migrates our payment processor, which was a nightmare, by the way. If you ever show up to our Discord office hours, ask me about the time that my startup migrated from Stripe to Braintree if you want a great story. But the bottom line, though, is we were doing a lot. And if you look closely, you'll even see the Jim Collins quote and talk of how we need to keep pushing ourselves to the very limits of what we think is possible. Gotta love startup culture, right? But to be fair, when you first start using Hasura, you realize that you can legitimately build entire SaaS applications with a team of 2 people in under 2 months. So I want to pose a not so rhetorical question because really this is important to understand when you think about Hasura. What if 80% of building a SaaS application just meant creating an ERD? I pose this question because that's exactly the world I believe we already live in. And I personally pity the fool who thinks otherwise and would spend what would likely be weeks to write the CRUD operations on these 53 tables. That was what our backend looked like when we initially migrated to Hasura, before they could even think about the business logic or the oh so important features that the business actually cares about. It's so much wasted time and it's silly. Before too long, you'll be building things you only dreamed of. But it's not all sunshine and roses. With great power comes greater programmer egos. So don't be surprised when your developers start making comments about how all the apps they use suck and they could do it better. But to be fair, if they learn the lessons and heed the teachings and follow good domain driven design principles, after a couple projects with Hasura, they probably could do it better. Experience is the world's best teacher, and Hasura makes it really easy to get experience building highly performant and scalable applications that are also clean and idiomatic. There's a reason NASA uses us for their mission planning software after all. Hasura is honestly pretty badass. So without further ado, let's jump into a demo. Okay, let's jump in. This is the part that I was excited about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead. We're going to create a brand new blank project. We're going to use the free tier. I'm going to set it up in Ohio because that is close to me. We're going to go ahead and we're going to launch the Hasura console now. And as you can see, this is the glorious start of our journey. If anyone here is familiar with GraphQL and specifically graphical, then this should be relatively familiar to you. As you can see here, we don't have any queries right now. We also don't have any mutations. So the first thing that we're going to go ahead and do, we're going to go ahead and go over to the data tab. I've got a URL for my database that I'm going to connect to. So we'll say connect an existing database. I'll call it just DB for now. And this is just a, you could use, it's the same thing like as a JDBC driver. So should be relatively familiar. So as you can see now, I've got a database connected. And the first thing that we're going to do some stuff live here. So we're going to go ahead and create a new table in our database. We're going to create a table for users, which is something that we're going to be using in this example. We'll have user ID. For now, we'll call it text. We could do a UUID, but I don't feel like typing entire UUIDs this whole demo. So we're just going to go ahead and put it to text for now. We'll also maybe say that the user has a name, and that could be nullable. That's fine. We'll use this little hotkey to add some of my favorite frequently added columns where I can do things like automatically add a created at and automatically add an update at that'll trigger whenever they update data. And then we'll set a primary key on the user ID, and we'll go ahead and now we'll say, let's add this table. And so the cool thing is that's how simple it was for me to do all of my REST that I need, because now Hasura is going to go ahead and auto generate all of my REST for me. So I can actually already just start querying. And of course, it's going to be empty. It's also going to be quick because we haven't had any data in it yet. But let's go ahead and put some data in it. So we're going to go ahead and write a mutation, or I guess we'll call it insert data. And let's say, well, we want to insert a user. So I could sit there and type it all out, or I could even use this little thing, which is nice. So let's go ahead and we'll say that the name is going to be Tristen. And for my user ID, for now, let's just say like ABC or something silly. We're actually going to change this in a minute here. And let's get back all of this information. So right now, I can go ahead, run this insert, and boom, I've now got this data in my table. So let's go ahead. Let's insert another user for Praveen, my awesome co-host, who we're going to also add in, just so that we have a little bit of data to work with and play with here. So we'll go ahead, insert another user. And so now we can go ahead and if we run our query to get our users, we can see that we now have two users, myself and Praveen. The neat thing about this is that Hasura has auto-generated this. It's also going to auto-generate and give you the ability to do things like do an update. So let's go ahead and update my user ID. And we'll do that by saying update user by PK. I can go ahead and specify that my user ID is currently ABC. Let's make my user ID something more sensible. Like, for example, for now, we'll do my name. Now, before I run this though, what's neat about this is what I want to show you is we also have something called live queries or subscriptions. So this same query here, I could actually change that to a subscription, and then instantly I've now got a subscription running on my data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a new tab, and in that tab, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy and paste this mutation, and I'm going to now run it. It's going to update the ID. And whenever I say the word go, I want you guys to watch, because as soon as I say the word go, I'm going to press the run button. I want you to see just how quickly these updates happen. So I'm going to do that right now. Ready? Go. And then within 1 second, it's going to come back with a live subscription, which is just fantastic. Anytime you've dealt with live queries or subscriptions or polling, you know that that's such a tough thing to do. So it's amazing that Hasura just kind of gives you that for free. And just to show you guys kind of what's going on, it's not anything too crazy. You can see here, if we go to the users table, that, we have our data here, right? It's a Postgres database that's backing this. It's what you guys probably know and love already. And there's a lot of other neat features and neat things that we can do as well. So like, for example, let's say that this underlying table was a brownfield project, right? It's or even it could be a white field project. I've heard them call projects that have snow on them, right? Really old projects. You can take your existing project, plug it in, and then you immediately get the ability to perform all of those CRUD operations, your inserts, your updates, your deletes right away, even from an existing database. And sometimes those databases, we can't change the underlying names, right? Like sometimes we're not allowed to change those fields. And so what's great is Hasura will even let you do things like I can go ahead and I can edit one of these fields, for example, and I can set just a GraphQL field name. So for example, let's say that instead of user ID, I said, it'd be better to just have ID, right? We don't really need to prefix it with user. They'll know it's the user's ID. So, but I can't change that in my underlying database. That's fine. I can just change it in my GraphQL schema, right? I can just change it there, and then I can have it reflected instantly to be able to go ahead and let's run that subscription. And now I am getting this back. And if I wanted to, I could even alias this. That's the power of GraphQL, right? I could call this foo if I wanted to, and I could say that ID was bar. It doesn't really matter what I do. It'll let me do whatever I want it to be, and it'll give me back the data exactly how I ask for it, which makes life an absolute breeze for all of my developers, and all of the things that they might want to do. So that's a little bit of an intro about how Hasura lets you auto generate the CRUD operations on your guys' database, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, this is great, Tristan. So now what you've seen is basically like we've added a table, we've inserted some data using the Autogenerate API itself, and now we've been able to query it back. We've been able to customize the API as well, as we saw some legacy databases could probably have some weird database column names or prefixes or long form names, and it's so we've generated the API. We've seen how to do the manipulations and reads and whatnot. But how does this all work actually underneath, right? So the question would be like, hey, I have a schema I've added, but then how does this all work? What is the query generated underneath for this GraphQL query? As I mentioned before, it was Hasura is essentially a compiler which takes in this GraphQL query and then it converts it into a SQL query, right? So maybe I'll let Tristan showcase how all of this magic happens underneath, and then showcase how it's performant and whatnot. Yeah, what do you,
Yeah,
Tristan?
I'm super glad that you asked that, Praveen, because I think that's one of the coolest things about Hasura. And whenever I first tell people this is what Hasura is doing under the hood, a lot of the times I see like them go wide-eyed and they're like, "Oh, that's actually really cool." So all I need to do is click this little analyze button, for you guys to really start to understand what's going on. So what Hasura is actually doing is it's essentially compiling GraphQL down to SQL. So the Hasura engine itself tracks some of the metadata that gives you the underlying information you need about your table, and it compiles it not just to SQL, but to performance SQL that allows you to perform things like joins and solve the n+1 query. So like if you look, we've got some pretty fancy, there's JSON aggregation. Like either the query can look a little bit nasty, but this is extremely performant. It's not the kind of thing you would necessarily want to be sitting there writing by hand, but so many people still do, Praveen. So many people are still spending days of their time optimizing, that one nasty SQL query to try and get it to return faster when they shouldn't be doing that. They don't need to be doing that. But I do tell people, like, even if you're not going to use Hasura, cool. Like, don't. There's tools. I get it. You've got to find what works for you. Just use it to pull this SQL. Use it to get your performance SQL. Take your existing database, plug it in. You don't want to use the tool itself. That's fine. Just have it spit out optimized SQL, and at the very least, save yourself time. But under the hood, it's doing this where it's compiling the GraphQL to SQL, and we're also adding additional data sources as well. We're doing some fancy things like inferring schemas from Mongo. There'll be more about that coming in the future. But to really understand kind of what's going on, it's important to go and take a look. So Hasura has this concept of metadata, right? And I'm going to go ahead and, not import. I want to export my metadata and just give you guys a peek of what that looks like. So let me go ahead. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'm going to pop open a Visual Studio Code real quick just to give you guys a quick peek at that. So, hold on just a second.
Meanwhile, I will just answer a couple of questions that have been asked on chat. Satyan Bhaktavachalu has asked a question about whether Hasura has declarative API authorization. Does it complement OPA? So Hasura has declarative authorization, right? So you have something called metadata in Hasura where you can declare the roles of your system, of your permission system. So for example, if we have a user role, if you have a public role, your admin role, you can define permissions for CRUD operations to say, hey, this role is not supposed to access this columns in the database or this rows in the database based on some filters, right? So you can do that. And I think Meng Wu has a question about direct reflection of the underlying data schema. So basically, Hasura, I mean, obviously it introspects the database for getting the API pretty quickly. But then, of course, as Tristen showcased, you can edit the column or the table names for the GraphQL schema that is generated. So you can completely customize the GraphQL schema that has been generated. With the Hasura V3, what is changing is, and what we're showing is V2, right? And with V3, you can start with the GraphQL schema design, and it need not necessarily be like a one-to-one mapping to the database, but underlying API can still be like talking to a database, right? So, so you can define a different GraphQL schema already with V2, but with V3 it will be even more customizable. But with V2, I think, as Tristen showcased, you can customize the schema and not be a one-to-one mapping exactly. And we'll also go over into a slightly more detail with the actions and transforms, where if you have an existing REST API, you can just directly use that to map it to the GraphQL API and not change your underlying data. So we can go over that as well.
Yeah,
Tristen,
I'm
sorry.
really exciting about that because hopefully we'll have time at the end, because I think if we can get through it all, I promise everybody on this webinar you're going to want to see those actions and events. So, but this is an example of kind of what the underlying metadata looks like. I know you're all shaking your head at me for exposing this right here, but I'm going to delete it and change it as soon as this demo is over. So don't shake your finger too hard. We've got, it kind of just lays out this underlying declarative metadata that kind of explains what you've got. In this case, we only have one table we're tracking, but this allows the underlying Hasura engine to do that thing where it is compiling that GraphQL to SQL because it knows what your underlying database schema is, and then it can auto-generate all of those GraphQL, those schemas for you, and automatically stitch that schema together, and even give you composable entities that you can, or composable predicates on those entities. So let me switch back. So let's go ahead and let's dive in. We talked a little bit about how the CI/CD works and also kind of what's happening under the hood with that. So I think now a lot of people are probably curious about authorization and how that works. So I think that's an important question, and I want to talk a little bit about what happens under the hood. So Hasura lets you use the JWTs that you already know and love. I know a lot of enterprise customers are probably interested in things like entitlements and permissions. Uh, so that is something, and actually, I'd love to start a poll. We did have a poll. I'm curious, are you more interested in entitlement-based authentication or role-based access control? So we're gonna pop a poll up here. I'd love to learn more about your guys' use cases. I know a lot of the times with enterprises, there's going to be a lot of need for entitlement, but then a lot of people are still using role-based. Um, so thanks so much, everyone that's filling that out. But what I want to jump into here is exactly how these permissions work with Hasura. So let's go to this user table, and just kind of to give a brief example, I could go ahead and create a new role called user, and then I can give them specific permissions over my graph where I could do things like a custom check where I could say like the user ID must equal something that I specify that I could even pull in from like session or environment. Or I could also just set a blanket permission for that role where I could say, okay, let's go ahead and say that the user is allowed, a person with a user role is allowed to insert things and they're allowed to change the columns for name and user ID. But created and updated at will be set by the underlying database. I don't want them to have permission to do that, right? So I could go ahead and create these different permissions. And I could do the same thing for, say, select, let's say, where I could go ahead and I could say that I want to allow them to select the name and the user ID with the user. And the cool thing is now, if I go back to here, I can actually pass Xhasura, what is it, Praveen? Is it user role or just role?
Yeah, just user, no, access role. Yeah,
Yeah, that's
no,
okay,
just
cool.
role. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Sorry, guys. Sometimes you gotta. And then if I go ahead and I pass user here, you'll see now I can only see ID and name. I don't have access to that created and updated at. And the really cool things for the security journey here is you can actually allow list operations individually, set up permissions and operations that you want to allow. And then you also can provide a depth limit, a node limit, rate limits upon different roles. Like it's really, really powerful. Because think about that. Like you could rate limit a user's role and you could say like, hey, I only want them to be allowed to like send 5 requests a minute or whatever. But then for like your backend role, that's like, backend to backend communication, you could give it a higher rate limit, or you can say whether something can do batch requests. So a lot of really amazing opportunities here for the security journey, and it all is just with those same JWTs that you know and love and are used to. Um, and so really neat journey there. And that covers a little bit of how we handle the security and auth. And the cool thing is you are able to actually pull out. You could also pass Xhasura user ID as well. And when you pass these things, you can pull those out from the engine and pass those through to your custom business logic. You can extract all the information from the JWT claims and then have access to that on the server side as well. So not only can you validate, it gives you almost a zero trust environment where you can use a backend secret and you can forward the JWT so that you can say, not only do I know that this request is coming from my backend, I also know that the user is who they say they are, which is just really fantastic, especially in this day and age. That talks a little bit
Yeah.
about our auth journey. I'd love to keep moving here
Yeah.
on that things, because I know the next thing we wanted to explore was I think it was relationships, right, Praveen?
Yeah. I think, yeah, just you can like, yeah, probably create another table and then showcase how you can join across those two tables and then show the power of relationships within Hasura.
So we're going to go ahead and create a new table called file. I'm going to say it has a file ID. We'll say this one's an integer. We're also going to say that it has a user ID field to have a relationship to the user ID table that we made earlier. And then lastly, we'll say that it has some data. We'll just make the data text for now. And we'll say maybe that the data can be nullable, just why not, right? Just to have fun. The cool thing is here, I'm going to go ahead and set up a forum relationship from the users table where I'm going to point user ID to user ID. We'll set it up to cascade so that whenever an update or a delete happens, it'll cascade that through, right? So should all be things that everybody's kind of familiar with. And then we'll go ahead and we'll add this table here. And now when we add this table, you'll see I need to now go to the data and I'll now see that I have these untracked relationships or untracked foreign key relationships. I can go ahead and track these relationships, and then I can go back to my API, and now I'm going to copy and paste a little demo query that I had set up because I also want to show a neat little feature that we have called query variables that I want to use here. And for those query variables, oh, I was missing a bracket there. I can go ahead and I can actually pass in variables into my, why does this say, oh, okay, hold on. Let me just refresh this because it's needed to, oh, it's because I have this. See, I tricked myself with the roles there, guys. That's how secure it is. But so now I can actually go ahead and I can do things like batch inserts where I just inserted 2 files for myself. So now I can actually go ahead and if I want to do a query, get user, let's say, I could say user, and then I could say, get me all of that user's information, but also get me their files. Let's walk that relationship, right? If I wanted to, I could even specify a limit. I only want one of each user's file, right? That's all that I want. I want one of each user's file. Oh, let me strip out those variables. And voila, I can now see I've got one user and I was able to get their files, but I was able to limit that, right? Because we don't always want all of them. A lot of the times we might want like the top 5, right? Their top 5 friends, the top 5 from a list. And so this performs highly performant M+1 joins. You can see that this was 82 milliseconds there, it's quick. And with V3, we actually almost reach native level performance with cross database joins with databases running in the same region. So a lot of
And
really
quick
exciting
check,
stuff there.
Tristen, can we also showcase the SQL that is generated for this join query as well so that we
Yeah,
know that there's no
absolutely. That's a great
N+1
idea.
problem? Yeah.
So here, let me go ahead and just analyze this. And as you can see, more of our magic here, right? It's a left outer join lateral, and then we coalesce from JSON aggregation. It's pretty fancy,
Yeah.
but it
So
is very performant. You would not want to write this by hand.
yeah, and the essential bit here is, I mean, there is a JSON aggregation magic that's happening with Postgres here, but then eventually, as irrespective of the depth of your query or the nested relationship that you use, it's going to be a single SQL query that is generated here, which is making it highly performant, as opposed to writing your own GraphQL server where you're actually going over this N% problem and then optimizing for data loaders and batching as a solution. So I just wanted to showcase this as an example.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super happy that we went over that as well. This is one of my favorite tabs, and I think for any nerds in the chat, feel free to let me know if you appreciate this tab as well, because anytime you see something like this, it just makes me smile. I think it's so cool and nerdy. I'm a huge nerd if you guys can't tell. So where are we at with time, Praveen? Do you think we have time to get into some of the custom business logic?
Yeah, I think we can go over actions and showcase people about the Open API spec and yeah, some of them.
Awesome, awesome. Oh, and one last thing before I forget to, for all of you REST API people out there, all of these things that we do can be RESTified. All I have to do is click REST and I can generate a REST endpoint that will expose this. So now I've got a REST endpoint that I can send my request to, and then I can even go as far as exporting it from Open API spec, right? So a lot of really powerful things there. Don't feel like because you have a room full of Rust developers that you should be scared, because really all you need is one person that maybe totally understands what's going on with the GraphQL, and then you can still Rustify all of this and expose it just like your developers would be used to. So for the people that maybe aren't quite ready for that shift left, that's something that's awesome that we can do. And then let me go ahead and go to the actions here. So for actions, we've got something super awesome where I can go ahead and number one, if you had an existing Open API, you could actually, if you wanted to, go ahead and import that entire Open API spec, and then you could use that to include that Open API spec in your GraphQL. But we can also create a new action. And basically what this is going to do, it allows you to link to a webhook or a cloud function or an API that you already have. So you can specify what the input is GraphQL. You can specify the output, right? And then you can just point it at your webhook, right? So say you have some webhook or some API, you can point it there and then it will call that. You can set it up to do things like forward those client headers, like I was saying, where I could say, hey, maybe I want to forward my headers and I want to re-authenticate my JWT on my backend service, right? Or I could also pull in something from an environment variable here, and maybe I could pass a backend event secret so that I can guarantee that the call is coming from my GraphQL engine, right? And then what's neat is you can even do these request transforms where I can do a payload transformation where I can actually use a templating language here. And I know that we're doing some cool stuff in our new version v3 that'll hopefully improve the user journey for this. But I could use a templating language to choose how I actually wanted to expose this. So, I could go ahead and I could alter this to maybe I didn't want to pass that password. Maybe I only wanted to pass that name. I could even alter it before it hits my API. So I could make it fit the schema of whatever external API I wanted, which is super, super powerful. So this is, basically just something that allows you to link to a cloud function or an existing API. And the journey for this gets a lot better. We've got some really cool stuff happening with V3. With that said, I do think it's really important also to talk about events before we jump into the Q&A. So I'm going to go on over to the events tab. These are one of my favorite things about Hasura. You can actually create an event and you can plug into the change data capture from Postgres. So I can plug into the underlying change data from Postgres and I can say something like every time the user's ID or every time something gets updated for the user, right? Well, when the user ID gets updated, then I want you to go out and call some webhook and perform some action. Or whenever an insert happens or a delete, and then I can actually have all of these events running, and I can even do a request transform here. And just to show you guys what this will look like, it's actually really neat. You'll get the underlying Postgres stuff where it'll say, hey, here was your old data. Here's what the new data looked like. You get trace context, you get delivery info. We have built-in retries. And we even have the ability to schedule these as both crons or as an event. So it's really, really powerful. To tell a little story about the last time that I used it. The last time that I used crons, I needed to integrate a single action, which we wanted to be able to interchange. We can use the term endpoint interchangeably for the rest folks in the crowd, but it needed to be able to handle the payment processing for Stripe, Google Pay, and Android Pay for purchases. But we wanted to do it all in one action where we had a payment request that we would submit, and then that would get entered into our transaction ledger. Well, that would trigger an event which would then attempt to process the payment. And then we had a cron that would run in the background every 30 seconds to talk to Apple's server and Google's server and validate any pending transactions on the server side, and then mark those as complete and issue out the credit. So there's a lot of really powerful event-driven flows that it can unlock. I don't know, if you're an event-driven nerd like me, it's definitely something to think about.
Yeah. As we are on the events, right? I think there's a question also on chat about background job queues. I think probably the cron triggers, we can also showcase cron triggers and one of schedule events.
Absolutely. The crons, the way that it works is it uses a cron schedule, which can you still see this, the tab? I'm assuming it should still be screen sharing. So the cron, it's similar to PG cron if you're familiar with that. I think, is that what it uses under the hood currently for V2, Praveen? Are you aware?
I think, typical cron tab spec. I think, this configuration should work. Yeah.
So it hooks into essentially PG cron, and you can say, I want to trigger this And then, yeah, it'll function just like a job queue. And I know we've also been in discussions about how we want to handle events with V3 as well. There is talk of all different kinds of things, including things like Kafka and other things coming into play where we're thinking about that because we know that that's something important to our users. So, but does that hopefully help to answer that question?
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, right, I think cron triggers, it's not tied to a database also, so you can specifically like run your webhook and then it can essentially act as your cron API. So you can schedule events further off and like in recurring interval as your
Yeah,
cron
you can even do
configuration looks
one-off
like.
scheduled events. So if you
Yeah,
needed to do like a switchover, right? You're planning some big migration, everything's on fire. At least you can make it so you've just got this one-off scheduled event where you can say, okay, at this time on this day is when we start our switchover. We can schedule the event and we can kick everything off, right? So there's a
yeah.
lot of power there.
Yeah, and there's another question from Meng about error handling with events. I think so. What happens when an event ends up in an error state, right? I think so. Yeah, maybe Tristan, if you want to like
Yeah,
show
absolutely.
over
So
ending events.
whenever you schedule an event, here, let me just make one real quick. Let's just make a random event that'll just so that I can get a view of, oh, hold on. So whenever you do this, the way that it'll essentially happen is you'll have a list of pending events and a list of processed events. And the way that it'll work is it keeps track. This is kind of an underlying thing where it's going to keep track of the number of retries, right? And it's essentially going to attempt to do that exactly. It's not exactly once because we all know that's not actually possible, right? Like, haha, fun as much as Kafka might talk about it or whatever. Like we all know that distributed, that's a hard problem, right? But what this will do is you specify when you create these events, you specify the number of retries, right? The retry interval, so how long it's going to wait before it retries again, and you specify a timeout. And so whenever that happens, right, what it'll essentially happen is I could change this and say, okay, well, let's have it retry 3 times, and I would probably set this to 60 as well because I'd want to wait for the timeout. So then essentially it would try once, it would retry again 60 seconds later, and then it would retry one last time. And then you can actually see which events were successfully processed and which ones failed as well. So you could also set up something in the background to say handle failed events where you wanted to pull those in and check and see, oh, did this work? Yada, 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 so on and so forth. Does that answer the questions?
Yeah, I think so. Also, I think quickly on the custom business logic story, we've seen what we can do with REST APIs that you already have. With the remote schemas, you can also like bring in your existing GraphQL API that you already have written, so that you can start incrementally adopting Hasura. Like if you already have written your GraphQL server in Node.js or Java or whatever language, as long as it's an endpoint that you can expose, you can add it to a remote schema through Hasura, and you can also then establish relationships between them as well. All right. And yeah, Tristan is also like showcasing on the monitoring tab, so you can like monitor
Yeah,
the
the
requests that are
monitoring
coming in.
tab is super cool as well because it allows you to see all the things that are happening. You want to talk about monitoring and observability. You can't tell me this isn't great, right? Like you can see here, the latencies of all your different queries, and you can see that it's pretty dang fast, right? Like you can see your requests per minute. You can see all of this amazing information. You can see which operations are being called, when they're successful, when they've failed, who called them. You can see when subscriptions are happening, the number of subscriptions. There's all kinds of really amazing information that you can pull in from the monitoring as well. So that's one other thing to showcase and talk about, which I think is super powerful. We're not scared to show people our latencies because we know they're fast.
Yeah, it's also a
um,
function of your database is hosted. So we recommend like co-locating your API deployment of Hasura and also your database and also your custom logic. So it's a factor of that, and typically closer to your users as well, where your applications use cases. So that's
Absolutely. Now, before we get into QA, I wanted to offer one last little piece of advice for anyone listening. If you're thinking about using Hasura, here's just a personal recommendation I have. whenever you first evaluate Hasura, if you can, try to do it on a greenfield project, because it's not to say that you can't incrementally bring over your legacy projects. You can, but a big part of using Hasura, it depends on your underlying data model. If you have a really good layout of your underlying data model, then Hasura will make your life so easy, because it will basically automate a lot of the work for you. What I sometimes see is people will bring big legacy databases that maybe did not have very great data modeling or data domain modeling. And then they'll say, why is this complicated? And why is it a little bit of a struggle? When in reality, Hasura is exposing exactly what your data model is. So if your data model is a little bit rough, then yeah, it's going to be the same amount of rough as it was before you used Hasura. In some ways, you'll get all of that stuff for free, but it can't fix underlying bad data modeling. So I always do recommend people, and it's not always feasible. If you have a big team and a lot of people, you can't always allocate resources and do a greenfield project. But I do tell people, if you're going to try Hasura, try it the way that it was meant to be used, if you're truly wanting to evaluate and understand it, which means build a new project with it, build something that's event driven, take advantage of those features, learn how it works and see how we recommend you do it, and then make your decisions. And then decide whether you want to, build something new or move something old over or whatever it might be. But I just truly do think that that is so powerful. And I think that kind of covers everything that we had today. I would love to get in some questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We've got some slides we were going to pop up. And just also, so everyone's aware, before you hop off, we do have our Discord office hours coming up right immediately after this ends. So if anyone wants to stop and chat with me, chat with Praveen, talk to us about this, talk to us about anything Hasura, especially V3, and learn more about that, make sure you're in our Discord server and definitely stop by when this ends, because we'll be going into that.
Yeah. Quick check on socials. You can follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. We've put in our links. It will be shared on chat as well. And as Tristen mentioned, join us for the Discord office hours. It's going to start literally after this webinar ends at 10 a.m. PST. It's a recurring event, so feel free to join in every week and then post your questions. We typically do a Hasura V3 preview for early access folks. It's already alpha, and it's already available for people to try it out. So people can already sign up and then try out V3 and then post in feedback. And you can obviously interact with us during the Discord office hours as well. Any questions? So we already have, I think, 4 Q&A questions that are unanswered. So Tristen,
Okay,
maybe
let me
let's
go ahead and pop
them.
over there.
Yeah, I think Mengu has asked a question about Apollo Federation. How does Apollo and Hasura Federation layer work together? Yeah, so there are a couple of ways you can use this, right? So Hasura can be used as a subgraph to your Apollo Federation if you already have Apollo Federation set up. Or you can also use Apollo Federation in within Hasura. You can add your Apollo servers that you've already written or any other GraphQL server and add them to Hasura. We do support Apollo Federation spec as well. I can probably link it to the docs as we speak.
Okay, is the concept of mutations and subscriptions a better alternative to stored procedures? So mutations and subscriptions are a little bit different than stored procedures. We still actually have the ability to do things like stored procedures. So it's called native queries for us, or we also have stored procedures where you can actually create or track these, and then you can link into those as well. Query and mutation is more along the line, or subscription and mutation is more along the lines of a GraphQL thing. So we're kind of piggybacking off of the GraphQL language and how GraphQL works. So hopefully that answers that question. If not, please pop in the chat or stop by our Discord office hours. Is Hasura equally compatible with both MongoDB and Postgres? So right now it is got great compatibility with Postgres, but I will say Mongo is our next big step. Right now there's a lot of work and effort going. Mongo's our next our first foray into that NoSQL world. And so we are working very diligently. I know actually the engineer, I was talking with him just the other day, that's working on the Mongo connector, which by the way is being written in Rust, highly performant, just like our new V3 engine was completely just rewritten almost from the ground up, not even a rewrite, more like a rebuild to help satisfy our enterprise customers and their needs. So hopefully that will help answer that one. How does cross VPC secure networking work for Hasura to connect our DPs or DBs and services and private VPCs? So Meng, what I would say for that one, maybe come talk with me personally, stop by our office hours. Maybe that would be a better thing for us to maybe chat about outside of this, because I think I actually had a blog post I put out a while ago about how to like set up the VPC and do all that, but I think that might be a little in the weeds. So we would have to go in depth on that, but don't get me wrong, I'm happy to. I just don't know if we would have the time for this this right now. When are you planning to support federation for V2? So V2 already has different forms of federation actually. So you can pull in remote schemas. Oh, I stopped sharing my screen, but if I was sharing, I could show that. But you can pull in remote schemas where you can take your existing GraphQL and you can plug them in. But we also have the ability to add additional databases, which we're working on. So like for right now, I think we have support with V2 for AlloyDB, Amazon Athena, BigQuery, Citus, CockroachDB, Microsoft SQL Server, MariaDB, MongoDB, MySQL, Oracle, Postgres, and Snowflake. So, and with varying levels of features and support, but keep in mind, we're adding support for everything. Our goal is to join all the things and make it so it's easy for you to get shit done. That's like my favorite saying. I love when I get to say that, but that's kind of the goal. So like, understand where we came from. Originally, it was just like something kind of similar to PostgREST, where it was like, oh, this is cool, but let's do GraphQL flavor, and let's also add these other awesome features to make building fast and quick. But then we ended up building something that could be used at enterprise scale, and it was like, well, this is awesome. Let's add more connectors. Let's add more things. And anyone who's involved in that space, reach out to me, because I've built a lot of connectors now actually for V3. And I'll continue to build more. Some of the ones that I've been excited about are Terso. I built that. Quadrant, a vector database. Terso's distributed SQLite. I also built one with DuckDB that we're working on, so you can even write SQL over your S3 OLAP via GraphQL. So we're getting really fancy, but lots of neat stuff. But I think that's mostly all the time that we have. And I do have those Discord office hours. So please join us. Come actually talk to me. You get to talk back this time instead of just having me talk at you. And super excited and so happy to have had everyone here. And I really hope this was useful. So please join us for Discord. Message me if you have any questions. You can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, all different sorts of places. Feel free to reach out. Would love to chat. And thank you so much, everybody, for being a part of this and for being a part of the awesome Hasura community.